HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Rest I Will Kill, William Tillman and the Unforgettable Story of How a Free Black Man Refused to Become a Slave, by Brian McGinty, read by Sean Crisden. Prologue. Early in the afternoon of Sunday, July 21st, 1861, the merchant schooner S.J. Waring passed through the Narrows, which guard the entrance to New York Harbor, and sailed toward the Battery at the foot of Manhattan Island. A harbor pilot had come aboard to guide the vessel safely into port, but the man in real command was a 27-year-old free black man from Rhode Island named William Tillman. Young, strong, and determined, Tillman had left New York only 17 days earlier as the Waring's cook and steward on a commercial voyage that was to have taken it to Montevideo, Uruguay, and Buenos Aires, Argentina. But the voyage was interrupted only 4 days out of New York when the vessel was stopped at sea and boarded by privateers from the Confederate States of America. Declaring the schooner a prize of the war then being fought between the North and the South, the privateers had taken command of the vessel and pointed it toward an unnamed secessionist port where it could be condemned. And Tillman, the only black man aboard, would be hauled in irons to a public auction and sold into slavery. Determined not to surrender his freedom to that fate, Tillman had recaptured the Waring when it was less than 1 day's sail from Charleston, South Carolina, and, defying the many dangers posed by the war-torn sea lanes then separating the schooner from New York, directed the vessel and its remaining crew back to the north. Preliminary reports of the Waring's misfortune at sea, picked up by other seagoing vessels, had leaked into New York, but the facts surrounding its return north were not known until Monday morning, when Tillman and the other men aboard came ashore and were questioned by the harbor police and newspaper reporters. The full story of his recapture of the schooner then became public, a story that astounded New Yorkers and excited newspaper readers throughout the country. Tillman's story commanded attention both because of the bravery he had demonstrated at sea and because of the unprecedented crisis in which the United States then found itself. Fort Sumter in the harbor of Charleston, South Carolina, had surrendered to Confederate artillery bombardment only 3 months earlier. On the same day that Tillman sailed the Waring back into New York Harbor, Union and Confederate armies had met in their first major encounter, the battle that would become known in the North as Bull Run, later called First Bull Run, and in the South as Manassas, later First Manassas. Confused and badly disoriented, the Union soldiers had fled the field of that conflict in humiliating disarray. In bold contrast, Tillman had rescued the Waring from its Southern captors. He had triumphed over the secessionists who sought to disrupt Northern shipping with their privateer vessels. Some called them pirate vessels, although Confederate sympathizers vigorously disputed the description. The black man was surrounded by enthusiastic crowds as he was taken to the headquarters of the harbor police, then to the offices of the United States Marshal and District Attorney, and then onto the stage of the premier entertainment venue in New York, P.T. Barnum's American Museum on Lower Broadway. Currier and Ives published a lithographic portrait of him that was used to advertise his appearances at Barnum's and helped to spread his fame beyond New York. He filed a claim in U.S. District Court for what the Admiralty law calls salvage, a monetary reward long guaranteed in English and American law for those who save imperiled vessels at sea. And after a spirited trial, the judge awarded him a handsome sum and warmly endorsed his maritime heroism. The North needed a hero, and Tillman filled the bill. But the public's focus soon changed, and Tillman's story fell into a long and in some ways understandable neglect. The nation sank deeper and deeper into a turbulent maelstrom of war and destruction. Larger and larger armies from all sections of the countries were sent into increasingly bloody encounters. Casualties in frightening numbers were suffered on both sides of the conflict. People in both the North and the South understood that the war was on at least one level about the institution of slavery as it was then practiced in the United States, and had been for nearly 3 centuries past. Just under 4 million men, women, and children were held in bondage below the Mason-Dixon line because they did not belong to the same race as the men who called themselves their masters. Strong, healthy black men, women, and children commanded good prices in the southern slave markets that dotted the land from Maryland and Virginia in the northeast as far as Arkansas, Louisiana, and Texas in the southwest. There was a market in slaves, much like the markets for land or stocks or bonds, that was a good source of profits for white men who knew when to buy and when to sell, when to take advantage of fluctuations in price, when to go to the market, and when to hold back. And the number of slaves was growing each year. Although the importation of slaves into the United States had been forbidden by federal law since 1808, smugglers still managed to bring some in via Caribbean islands, to show them in the slave markets and to reap the profits their illegal trading produced. But not all the African Americans in the United States on the eve of the Civil War were slaves. There were, according to the census records, about 500,000 free blacks, many of whom lived in the North. There, they were not burdened with legally enforced bondage, although they were denied most of the rights and privileges that white Americans enjoyed: the right to vote, to freely buy and sell land, to sit on juries, to patronize white-owned hotels and restaurants, and, perhaps most important, to attend schools with whites. Where schools existed, they were almost uniformly segregated, and the number of public schools that were open to African Americans was pitifully small. William Tillman was one of the free blacks who lived in the North. For 4 years, he had been employed as a cook and steward by Jonas Smith and Company, the Long Island-based owner of the S.J. Waring. He valued the employment, for it was better than the plight of so many other African Americans who had even more menial jobs, or none at all. But it did not offer any real chance of advancement. The United States was widely praised as a land of opportunity, a country in which men could rise from a lowly status to one of respect and even admiration. But the opportunities available to white men were almost completely denied to blacks, and the basic means of taking advantage of those opportunities were closed to African Americans because they were denied educations. They were not taught to read or write, and without these fundamental skills, even self-improvement was unavailable to them. And so, after his act of Civil War heroism was completed, William Tillman retreated, like millions of his fellow African Americans, into the shadows in which he had lived before the war. He slipped out of the public eye and was soon forgotten. The war continued to rage, but he was no longer its hero. The Civil War was in large part a struggle on land between opposing armies. Much of the conflict, however, took place at sea and on navigable waterways after Confederate President Jefferson Davis commissioned privateers to capture Northern ships, and Union President Abraham Lincoln declared a blockade of the southern coast. Tillman found himself in the middle of this struggle when he left New York aboard the Waring. The commissioning of Southern privateers, like the blockade of the Confederate coast, raised troubling issues that lay at the heart of secession and the resulting war. Was secession constitutional? Did the Confederate States of America acquire true independence and national sovereignty as a result of their secession? Or was their action nothing more than rebellion and treason? These issues sharply divided Lincoln and Davis and had profound repercussions in the maritime combat of the war. They were litigated in 2 trials that took place in Philadelphia and New York, at about the same time that William Tillman's trial was heard in New York, and the trials produced dramatically different results, with captured privateers in Philadelphia being convicted of piracy and sentenced to death, and privateers in New York escaping punishment as the result of a hung jury. Tillman's story must be told against the background of these fundamental issues, for they impinged on the legality of what he did. Were the privateers who captured the Waring criminal pirates? Was Tillman justified in rising up against them and recapturing the schooner? Or were they the duly constituted representatives of a sovereign foreign nation, and as such, people whom Tillman was obligated to obey? The story told in this book centers on the bravery of William Tillman, the emotional torture he suffered when the Confederates threatened to enslave him, and the perils he overcame in bringing himself and the S.J. Waring back to New York from their Southern captivity. But it is not his story alone. For millions of other black Americans, some born free like Tillman, others born into bondage, suffered similar oppression and indignity in the 19th century. Many displayed courage and valor similar to Tillman's during the war and were similarly forgotten after the fighting concluded. I have made serious efforts to discover the facts of Tillman's life after he was acclaimed as a hero in the early days of the Civil War. Beyond a few bits of fragmentary information and a lot of speculation, however, the story of the life he led in later years has all but disappeared. He has become a cipher, a dimly remembered footnote to a tumultuous chapter in America's past, one of millions who were shunted aside, hidden, and forgotten. But Tillman should not remain a forgotten hero, for the perils he faced aboard the S.J. Waring were genuine. The bravery he displayed in rescuing himself and the schooner from those perils was equally so, and the acclaim showered on him when he brought the Waring back to New York helped, if only briefly, to buoy Union hopes for eventual victory in the conflict then raging between the North and the South. 1. A free black man. William Tillman was born in Milford, Delaware, about 1834. His parents were free blacks, and as such members of a small but significant colony of free African Americans in a state that sanctioned slavery. Delaware was the most northerly state whose laws still authorized human bondage in 1861, although the number of slaves there was small and growing smaller each year. African Americans had lived in the area that was later to become the United States for nearly 300 years before Tillman was born. Some had come to Florida in the 16th century with French and Spanish colonists, some to the New Netherlands, later New York, with Dutch mercantilists in the 17th century, yet others to Virginia with English settlers in the 17th and 18th centuries. Swedes were the first Europeans to settle the area later called Delaware, which they called New Sweden. Their occupation, however, was short, for in 1655 the Swedes were ousted by the Dutch, who were in turn ousted by the English only 10 years later. The first African American to arrive in Delaware was a man named Anthony, often called Black Anthony in histories of Delaware, who was brought there by Swedish colonists in 1639. Little is known of Anthony. The scanty record shows that he worked for one of the governors of New Sweden and eventually purchased some goods for himself, perhaps because he had by that time become a free man. Many thousands of African slaves were brought to Delaware after Anthony, some by the Swedes, but most by the Dutch. The agriculture the Dutch introduced into the area required laborers to till the land, plant and harvest the crops, and load them onto ships for transport to nearby colonies, the Caribbean, or Brazil. Since the Dutch themselves were unwilling to perform the necessary agricultural labor, they procured Africans to do the work, and slavery soon became a booming industry and an integral part of the colony's social and economic life. Most of the slaves came to Delaware on slave-trading ships that sailed from the west coast of Africa to the Atlantic seaboard, while others may originally have been free men and women who were made slaves only after they set foot in Delaware. Many came from the eastern shore of Maryland, a richly productive agricultural area that abutted Delaware on the west and south, while others were brought north from Virginia, which occupied the southern end of the Delmarva Peninsula below Maryland and Delaware. Evidence suggests that a number of slaves were brought by boat from the Carolinas, and even more from New York, where slavery persisted through the first quarter of the 19th century. Although there were many farms in Delaware, a plantation economy on the scale of Virginia and the Carolinas never developed there. Tobacco was the first profitable crop, but it quickly depleted the soil and prompted colonists to replace it with corn and wheat. Slaves constituted an estimated 20% of the population of Delaware when the English took over in 1664, but by 1790, when the first U.S. census was taken, there were only 15%. While free blacks were 7%. As a result, Delaware in 1790 had the largest percentage of free blacks of any state in the Union, with Maryland and Virginia having only 2% each, and Pennsylvania and New York just 1%. The road to freedom for a slave in Delaware was often long and tortuous. A few of the state's free blacks may have achieved their free status in northern states and kept it after they relocated to Delaware to find employment, while others were able to purchase their freedom from owners who had lost confidence in the economic viability of slavery and preferred to invest their capital more productively. Since the growing season in Delaware was short, consisting mostly of the warm months of June, July, and August, farmers could save a lot of money by hiring free laborers to work for only 3 months of the year instead of having to support slaves the year round. Most slaves, however, achieved their free status through formal documents signed by their owners, called manumissions, either during their owners' lifetimes or by testament upon their deaths. Fully aware of the system's brutality, whites in Delaware rarely questioned its morality during the colonial period. Like slaveholders in other colonies, they regarded the institution as a settled part of their economic and social structure. Beginning in the Revolutionary period, however, they began to express some doubts about the institution. The Enlightenment, which had done so much to inspire the war for independence from Great Britain, was in part responsible for the change in thinking. If, as the Declaration of Independence declared, all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and if these include the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, what justification could there be for consigning some men to the degradation of chattel slavery? Religious thinking about slavery was also evolving. Most of the traditional churches had not questioned the morality of the institution, but some newer disciplines were beginning to condemn it. The Society of Friends, Quakers, was one of the first to question the morality of slavery, although many Quakers had in fact owned slaves in the early colonial years, and the Methodist Church began in the late 18th century to preach that slavery was morally wrong. In the early part of the 19th century, however, Methodism would lose its anti-slavery fervor and defend it in many southern states. For all these reasons, and perhaps others, some economic, some undoubtedly political, the number of slaves in Delaware declined dramatically in the early years of the Republic, with 6,153 in 1800 and only 1,798 in 1860. During the same period, the numbers of free blacks increased from 8,268 in 1800 to 19,829 in 1860. Beginning in the 1790s, there were periodic efforts to end all slavery in Delaware. An attempt to include emancipation in the state constitution adopted in 1792 was unsuccessful. In 1803, a bill introduced in the state legislature to abolish slavery on a gradual basis failed by 1 vote. And in 1847, another bill to gradually abolish slavery failed by 1 vote in the state Senate. While slavery was declining in Delaware, it was also under siege in other, more northern states. Slavery had been practiced in all the North American colonies at early dates, but a concerted movement to emancipate slaves began in Vermont in 1771, continued in Massachusetts and Pennsylvania in the 1780s, and reached 4 other northern states by 1804. New York did not abolish the institution until 1827, Connecticut not until 1848, and a form of involuntary servitude survived in New Jersey right up to the Civil War. While slavery was under attack in northern states, it seemed to be growing weaker and weaker in Delaware. Some, in fact, thought it was on the verge of dying. Yet the powers that be were stubbornly resistant to proclaiming its death. As early as 1787, when the Constitution was drafted in Philadelphia, it became clear that the United States would be divided between free states in the North and slave states in the South, for the National Charter included key provisions whose sole purpose was to win support from Southern slaveholders. Delaware was in the South, although not in the Deep South, and its sympathy for the institution that was growing larger and more powerful with each passing year in Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, and the newer slave states to the west, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, Missouri, and Texas, was persistent. Why, then, was slavery abolished in the northern but not the southern states? It has been argued by some that the soil and climate in the northern states were not suitable for the kind of large-scale farming that made slave labor so profitable farther south. If they had been, Northerners would have been as strongly attached to slavery as Southerners, for they were every bit as fond of making money, regardless of the moral cost, as their Southern brethren. But this explanation has been challenged on the grounds that slaves had in fact been profitably employed on the small farms of the North before abolition began, and they could have been employed just as well thereafter. Further, slave labor was well adapted to the kind of manufacturing and commercial enterprises that increasingly characterized the North. The religious scruples of some Northerners accounted in part for the movement to end slavery in that part of the country, but so did the growing realization of many Northerners that it was hypocritical to deny freedom to one group of men while championing it for themselves. As the historian David Bryan Davis has written, slavery did not decline or disappear in the North because it was uneconomical, unproductive, or a burden on the economy. It ended because of ideas rooted in religion and the ideals of the Enlightenment. Southerners recognized the same truths as Northerners. The Declaration of Independence had, after all, been drafted by Thomas Jefferson, one of the most prominent of all the Southerners. But as time passed and Southern agriculture expanded farther into the South and the West, and as the production of cotton with cheap slave labor became more and more profitable, Southerners seemed to forget the ideals of the Revolution and developed elaborate justifications for the continuation of what they called the peculiar institution. In Delaware, in the middle of the 19th century, the thinking seemed to be divided, with a substantial part of the local population sharing the belief that slavery offended morality and justice, while another realized that slavery was profitable, and that it would be difficult to end it without upsetting the prosperity of the American South. A large number of whites also sympathized with Southern slaveholders and feared that free blacks would pose a danger to the white population. The slave revolution in Haiti in the 1790s, and black uprisings and conspiracies in Southern states, one led by Gabriel Prosser in Virginia in 1800, another by Denmark Vesey in South Carolina in 1822, and a third by Nat Turner in Virginia in 1831, had convinced many whites that blacks would rise up in a bloody furor unless they were kept under rigid constraints. And so Delaware was stalemated, watching silently as slavery seemed to dissolve but unable to declare a final end to it. William Tillman and his parents were members of the growing population of free blacks in Delaware. Beyond that fact, however, the available historical record reveals next to nothing about them. We do not even know how they acquired the surname of Tillman, or Tillman, Tilghman, or Tillman, Tilman, as the family name was sometimes spelled. Africans who arrived in the Americas came with no surnames in the European sense, and for most of the time they lived in slavery only with personal names. Eventually, however, it was expected that they would adopt surnames. By 1800, it is estimated that almost all the free blacks in Delaware had done so, and that those names were then, in the European fashion, applied to all members of their families. The Tillman name was neither particularly common nor rare in Delaware. Census and marriage records for the state reveal a fair number of black men and women named Tillman. Tillman, Tilghman, or Tillman, Tilman, some of whom may have been members of the same family as William Tillman. A free black named Prince Tillman, Tilghman, for example, was a tenant farmer in the late 1790s in Murder Kill Hundred in Kent County, where official records show that he owned 23 cattle, 25 sheep, 8 pigs, and 5 horses, altogether a considerable personal estate for any farmer in those days. The federal census for 1800 showed that the same Prince Tillman was the head of a household of 6 persons. Marriage records for Delaware show that he was licensed to marry one Sarah Jackson in October 1831. An entry in the 1840 census indicates that Prince Tillman was the head of a household of 7 persons, one of whom was a free black male under the age of 10 years. William Tillman was in that age group in 1840. The 1850 census reveals that Prince Tillman, Tilman, then 75 years of age, was living with Sarah Tillman, Tilman, then 50, in Dover Hundred in Kent County. The census also shows that a family of blacks named Tillman, Tilman, was living in Wilmington in Newcastle County in 1850. This family was headed by a 70-year-old man named John and included 6 children, one of whom was named William. This William Tillman, Tilman, however, was stated to be 21 years old, because the William Tillman, Tillman, who was aboard the S.J. Waring in 1861, would have been 16 years old in 1850. This entry is almost certainly not for the same man. The absence of verifiable records about William Tillman's life in Delaware is disappointing, but not particularly surprising, for many blacks lived lives of near anonymity throughout America in the years before the Civil War. Although we have more information that reveals the kind of lives free blacks lived in Delaware in the years leading up to the great national conflict, it is almost wholly dismal and discouraging. The antipathy, and in many cases fear, that whites felt for African Americans was reflected in a web of legal and social restrictions that made the lives of free blacks anything but equal to those then lived by whites. Much of that information comes from the research of a free black man from Philadelphia who went into Delaware in 1837 to conduct a study and report his findings to the American Anti-Slavery Society, of which he was an agent. William Yates regarded Delaware as a critical ground in the struggle for the abolition of slavery that was then being waged in most northern states. He reported his findings in a letter to 2 abolitionist newspapers then published in New York. Using figures derived from the federal census, Yates determined that there were only 900 slaveholders in Delaware and 56,701 residents who owned no slaves. Under this view of the case, he wrote, I had hoped to find slavery in Delaware merely nominal. He found instead that the free blacks in the state were only nominally free. Under the wretched and mongrel system of laws which have been acted in regard to them, he wrote, they enjoy but a mongrel liberty, a mere mock freedom. They are truly neither slaves nor free, being subject to many of the disabilities and disadvantages of both conditions, and enjoying few of the benefits of either. The employment opportunities available to free blacks in Delaware were not inviting. Most worked as farmhands or domestic servants. A few were able to become self-employed farmers by acquiring land as purchasers or tenants. As the number of free blacks in Delaware increased, many moved to cities and towns in hopes of finding better opportunities. By the 1850s, the greatest number of free blacks lived in and around Wilmington, in the northern end of the state or in the more southern communities of Milford, Milton, Lewis, Seaford, and Laurel. Most women found work as domestic servants or washerwomen, and most men became laborers. Some men, however, were able to work as waiters, cooks, gardeners, wagon and carriage drivers, or stable hands. A limited number of jobs were also available in skilled trades, such as carpentry, masonry, blacksmithing, coopering, butchering, weaving, and barbering. But because the jobs available to men in the urban centers were often of short duration, they frequently had to return to the farmlands and move from place to place looking for work. One inviting source of employment was available to free black men, however. This was on the ships and boats that plied the Delaware River and went out to sea loaded with the products of local farms. Maritime employment was not available to a large number of blacks, as the farms were not particularly large, and the number of available jobs were relatively small. But it was an opportunity that many longed for. The railroad that connected Wilmington in the north with Virginia in the south was not completed until 1859. So, the great bulk of cargo transportation in Delaware continued to be on water as the Civil War drew near. The poor employment opportunities in Delaware, coupled with the state's many restrictions on the freedom of blacks, persuaded more and more free blacks to leave the state in hope that they could find better lives elsewhere. Many slaves escaped their bondage with the aid of the Underground Railroad, while free blacks simply gathered up their possessions and headed north. First to Philadelphia, where slavery was prohibited by law, but also into New Jersey, New York, and beyond. If blacks were unhappy with their lives in Delaware, whites were no more pleased to have so many free blacks in their midst, and they took steps to encourage their exits. In 1849, the state legislature enacted a draconian law that made it illegal for free blacks in Delaware to be both unemployed and poor. If the local justice of the peace concluded that a free black was guilty of violating the statute, he ordered the sheriff to sell the offender to a master for whom...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?